My hand doesn't look like mine anymore. It's been 11 days since I bought the journal, and I keep holding my fingers under the desk lamp at 2 in the morning, turning them, spreading them apart, comparing them to a sketch drawn in 1923. The proportions match, not closely exact. The distance from the knuckle crease to the nail bed on my left index finger, rendered in graphite with a measurement notation beside it, 2.4 centimeters. I measured it this morning with a fabric tape. 2.4 centimeters. I haven't slept in 4 days. Not because I'm afraid to, though I am, but because every time I close the journal and leave it on the counter downstairs, something changes when I open it again. A new line of ink that wasn't there. A detail added to the final entry that I swear I'd already read without finding it. The page count stays the same. The binding hasn't been disturbed, but the last entry keeps filling in, getting more specific, like it knows I'm reading it now. I need to tell someone how this started, because I think by the time whoever hears this finds the journal, my handwriting and his won't be distinguishable anymore. I should start with the purchase. 6 weeks ago, mid-October, I drove down to Bridgewater for an estate sale. I run an antiquarian book and ephemera shop on the Harborton waterfront, second floor of a converted brick warehouse above a pottery studio. It's not thriving. I moved back to Vermont 2 years ago after my marriage ended, and my appraisal business in Boston lost its last institutional client in the same quarter. I took what savings I had and opened the shop because I know paper goods, I know regional history, and I figured the tourist trade plus online sales would keep me fed. It mostly does. I eat a lot of rice. Estate sales are where I source most of my inventory. I'll drive an hour each way for a good one, the kind where the family doesn't know what they have, and everything's priced flat. This one was posted on an estate liquidation board I follow. The listing was sparse. Contents of home, Bridgewater, Vermont. Books, papers, tools, furniture. All items sold as is. No photos, no itemized lots. Just an address and a date. I almost didn't go. It was a Wednesday, and I had a standing lunch with a dealer from Whitfield who wanted to consign some Civil War correspondence. But the listing kept pulling at me, maybe because the address was on Creek Road, which runs out past the college into farmland, and sales out there tend to come from old families with deep attics. Or maybe because of the handwriting. The listing was handwritten, scanned, and posted as a JPEG, not typed. And the script, I noticed this, the way you notice someone's accent, without thinking about it, the script looked familiar, comfortable, like someone taught us both from the same copybook. I didn't think much of it at the time. The house was a 1920s Cape Cod, cedar shingled, sitting back from the road behind a stone wall that had started to sag. Inside it smelled like cold radiators and candle wax, and that particular must you get from paperbacks stored in humidity-sweet, slightly chemical. The furniture was mostly gone already. What remained was in the basement and the sunroom. Boxes of books, a filing cabinet, some framed topographic maps, and a wooden crate of field equipment, a brass transit, a plumb bob, Surveyor's chains still in their leather case. I spent an hour going through the books. Nothing exceptional, standard Vermont histories, some decent Frost first editions with library stamps that killed their value, a box of National Geographics from the 40s. I was about to leave when I noticed the crate hadn't been fully unpacked. Under the chains, wrapped in oilcloth, was a leather-bound field book. Octavo format, maybe 5 by 8 inches, with a brass clasp. The cover was embossed with initials, ERV. I opened it. The paper was rag-content thick, cream-colored, barely foxed. The handwriting inside was the same hand I'd seen on the listing, precise, slightly forward-leaning, with distinctive T-crossings that angled upward. The first entry was dated April 12, 1923. A standard surveyor's field record, bearing, distance, monument descriptions, a chain and compass traverse running through what I guessed was Alcott County. Competent work. Detailed sketches of terrain features in the margins. I paid $35 for it. The woman running the sale, mid-50s, blonde, didn't give her name. put it in a brown paper bag and handed it to me without looking at it. I asked whose estate this was. She said she'd been hired through an agency and didn't know. I asked if there was a family I could contact about the surveyor's records. She looked at me then, held my eyes for a beat too long. "No family," she said. "That's why we're here." I drove back to Harborton with the journal on the passenger seat. It was raining, and the smell of the oilcloth mixed with the damp coming through my cracked window. I remember thinking the handwriting really did look like mine. Same pressure, same proportions, and dismissing it the way you dismiss things that feel too neat. That was the last time I dismissed anything about this journal. I didn't open the journal again until the following Saturday. It sat on the counter by the register all week, still in its brown paper bag, while I dealt with the ordinary business of keeping a shop alive, listing a set of hand-colored bird prints on my website, answering emails from a collector in New Hampshire who wanted daguerreotype cases, ringing up the occasional walk-in tourist buying a $50 map print for their lake house. Normal life. The journal was just inventory waiting to be cataloged. Saturday morning I came in early, before the shop opened at 10, with a coffee from the place on Cannon Street. October light through the tall windows, that low golden angle you get off Lake Morrow in autumn. I cleared space on my appraisal table, pulled on cotton gloves, and removed the journal from its bag. The leather was in better condition than I'd initially assessed. No cracking along the spine, which was unusual for something 100 years old that had been stored in a basement. The brass clasp still functioned smoothly. When I opened it, that smell hit me iron gall ink, the kind that went out of common use by the 1940s. Sharp, faintly metallic, with an undertone like black tea left too long. It's a smell I know from handling old documents, but this was stronger than it should have been. Concentrated, like the ink was fresh. The first 20 pages were exactly what I expected. Field notes from a land survey conducted in spring of 1923. The Surveyor ERV, based on the embossed initials, was methodical. Each entry began with a date, a starting monument description, and the weather. His notation was classic meets and bounds. North 47 degrees east, 12.60 chains to a stone monument at the NE corner of the Bridger lot. Sketches of witness trees, stream crossings, fence lines. The kind of work that would have been standard for a county surveyor mapping rural parcels in Alcott County. I photographed several pages for my records and began cross-referencing the locations mentioned. Some I recognized. Bridger is still a family name in the area, and the geographic features matched the Mill Creek drainage. This was legitimate period work. I estimated the journal's value at around $400 to the right buyer, a surveying history collector or a local heritage society. I kept reading. Pages 21 through 30 covered a different survey, a new parcel, different terrain, steeper ground. The description shifted from farmland to wooded ridge. The monuments changed from stone posts to blazed trees. And then, on page 21, I stopped. The entry was dated May 3, 1923. It began normally. Commenced at iron pins set in concrete at the southwest corner. Then a bearing, a distance. Then a description of the surrounding area. And within that description, a street address. Not a rural description. Not a meets and bounds reference to an adjoining lot owner. A modern street address, 14 Lakeshore Terrace, Unit 3. That's my apartment. The one I moved into 6 weeks before I bought this journal. I stared at it. I took my gloves off, put them back on, and looked again. The ink was the same throughout the page, same color, same oxidation pattern, same hand. It wasn't added later. It was written as part of the entry, as naturally as any other survey note. The line read, "The northern boundary runs parallel to the foundation of the dwelling at 14 Lakeshore Terrace, Unit 3, where the chain bearer will reside." Chain bearer. In surveying, that's the person who carries the measuring chain. The assistant, the one who follows. I set the journal down. The coffee had gone cold. I could hear the pottery studio below me starting up the thump of the wheel, the hiss of water, normal sounds. I looked out the window at the lake and tried to feel normal too. The address could be a coincidence. Lakeshore Terrace is a real street. It's been there since the 40s, when they developed that stretch above the waterfront. But it wasn't there in 1923. The street wasn't platted until 1947. I know this because I'd looked it up when I signed my lease, the way I look up everything. Because I live in old paper and local history, and it's the only thing that makes me feel competent anymore. I should have stopped reading. I should have closed the journal, put it in the display case with a price tag, and let some collector take it home. I almost did. I actually wrote a catalog entry that afternoon. 1923 Surveyor's Field Book, Alcott County, Vermont, leather-bound, excellent condition, $475, and saved it as a draft. But I didn't post it, because the handwriting, that familiar slant, the upward ticking T-crossings that I'd noticed on the estate sale listing, the pressure patterns that matched my own hand so closely I couldn't tell them apart without looking at the ink color. I went home that night and sat at my kitchen table and wrote my name on a blank sheet of paper. Then I opened the journal to a random page and held them side by side. The resemblance was there. Not identical, his letters were more practiced, more deliberate, but built from the same architecture. The same spatial relationships between characters. The same instinct for where to lift the pen. I told myself it was pareidolia. Pattern matching, run amok. I told myself I'd been alone too long and was making connections out of loneliness. I closed the journal, put it in my bag, and went to bed. At 3 a.m, I was up again, holding it under the kitchen light, reading page 22. Page 22 described a traverse I could walk in my sleep. Not because I'd memorized it from reading, because I walk it every morning. From my apartment on Lakeshore Terrace, down the hill past the old button factory, along the waterfront path to Cannon Street, then up the hill to the shop. 22 minutes on foot. I've done it nearly every day for 2 years. The surveyor's notes describe the same route as a chain and compass line. Not the streets didn't exist yet, but the terrain beneath them. The grade changes, the drainage patterns, the orientation to the lake. He was surveying the raw land that would become my daily walk, and his monuments, iron pins, blazed trees, stone piles corresponded exactly to the points where I pause every morning, the bench where I check my phone, the corner where I wait for the crosswalk, the doorstep of the pottery studio directly below my shop. I know how this sounds. I know that if someone told me this, I'd assume they were forcing connections that any walk through any town could be mapped onto century-old survey notes if you squinted hard enough. But these weren't vague correspondences. The bearings matched. I checked them with a compass app on my phone, standing at each point, and the angles were within 2 degrees of what ERV recorded in 1923. He was mapping my route before the route existed, before I existed. That was Sunday. I spent the whole day with the journal, reading slowly, cross-referencing against modern maps on my laptop. The radiators in the shop clicked and hissed. The light moved across the floor. I forgot to eat until 4 p.m, then walked to the deli on Elm Street and ordered a sandwich I barely tasted. The whole time, the smell of that iron gall ink stayed with me, faint, metallic, like I'd been handling pennies. Monday, I was back at the appraisal table before dawn. Pages 23 through 30 continued the same survey, the same area, in expanding circles, like the surveyor was mapping a territory centered on a specific point. Each traverse started from a different direction, but converged on the same coordinates. I plotted them on graph paper, and the convergence point was my shop. Not the building wasn't built until 1951, but the geographic point where my appraisal table sits, where I was sitting right then, plotting the lines. I put the journal down and went outside. The morning was cold, late October cold, where the wind off the lake has an edge to it and the leaves on the maples have gone past color into brown. I stood on the sidewalk and looked up at my windows and tried to feel like a rational person having a rational experience. A coincidence. A series of coincidences. The human brain is wired to find patterns, even where none exist. I'd read about this. Apophenia. The tendency to perceive meaningful connections between unrelated things. But the address. The address wasn't apophenia. 14 Lakeshore Terrace, Unit 3, written in iron gall ink on rag paper 100 years ago. That was specific. That was falsifiable. And I couldn't falsify it. That afternoon, Niels came in. Niels Henriksen, 68, retired from the State Highway Department where he'd spent 32 years as a licensed surveyor. He comes into my shop 2 or 3 times a week, mostly to look at maps and talk about boundary disputes. He's one of those customers who never buys anything expensive, but whose presence makes the shop feel like it serves a purpose beyond commerce. I usually enjoy his visits. He knows more about Vermont land records than anyone I've met. I hadn't planned to show him the journal, but it was on the table, open to the page with my address, and he noticed it before I could close it. That a field book? He was already reaching for it, the way he always reaches for things in my shop proprietary, like everything in here is partly his. Where'd you source this? Bridgewater estate sale, last week. He picked it up without gloves. That bothered me, though I couldn't have said why I'd been handling it without gloves myself for 2 days. He turned pages slowly, reading the entries with the fluency of someone who's written thousands of similar notes himself. His face changed as he read. Not alarm recognition, like he was greeting something. This is good work, he said. Clean traverses, proper closure. Whoever this was, they knew what they were doing. He looked at the embossed initials. ERV. Doesn't ring a bell, but I can check the old registry. State used to keep a list of licensed surveyors going back to the 1800s. Don't worry about it, I said. Too fast. He looked up. Something wrong with it? No, I haven't finished cataloging it yet. I don't want to get ahead of myself on provenance. He set it down, but his hand lingered on the cover. Let me know when you're ready. I'd love to read the whole thing. He smiled in a way that didn't quite reach his eyes. Feels like it's got more to say. I locked the journal in the display case after he left. I remember turning the key and hearing the latch click and thinking, that's enough. I'm done with it. I'll sell it online, ship it to a collector in another state, and forget about the address and the route and the handwriting. That resolution lasted until midnight, when I woke up and couldn't identify the smell in my apartment until I realized it was iron gall ink. The smell was strongest in the kitchen. Not overwhelming, just present, the way a neighbor's cooking seeps through shared walls. That metallic tang, slightly acidic, with the tannin undertone I associate with old correspondence and legal documents. I stood in the dark in my boxers and a t-shirt, breathing through my nose, trying to locate the source. The journal was locked in the display case at the shop 3 blocks away. I hadn't brought it home. I was certain of that. I checked my hands under the bathroom light. My fingertips were clean, no ink residue, no staining. But the smell was on them. Faint, like I'd been handling the journal in my sleep. I washed them twice with dish soap, and the smell remained, not on the skin exactly, but in the air around my hands, as if they were producing it. I didn't go back to sleep. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table watching the sky lighten over the lake, telling myself that old buildings have old smells, that the ventilation in my apartment pulls air from the basement where God knows what's been stored for decades, that iron gall ink is just tannic acid and ferrous sulfate and gum arabic, and there's no reason those compounds couldn't exist in pipe corrosion or old paint or 100 other mundane sources. By 7, I was at the shop. The journal was in the display case where I'd left it, the brass clasp still fastened. I unlocked the case and stood there looking at it without picking it up. The smell was here too stronger than yesterday, as if the book had been open all night exhaling into the room. The leather cover looked slightly darker than I remembered, like it had absorbed moisture overnight, though the shop's humidity stays constant. I'd spent good money on a dehumidifier for exactly that reason. I picked it up, opened it, turned past the pages I'd already read, past the converging traverse lines, past my address, to page 31. New territory. This entry was dated May 19, 1923. The survey had moved no longer in the area around Harborton, but somewhere I didn't recognize from the monument descriptions. Ridge terrain, heavy timber, slate outcroppings. The bearings suggested steep ground running roughly north-south. I couldn't place it from the field notes alone, but a sketch in the margin showed a distinctive rock formation, two upright slabs leaning against each other like a door frame, with a smaller stone wedged at the base. I'd seen that formation on a hike I'd taken last August, up on the spine of the mountains east of Hinton. I'd photographed it because it looked man-made too symmetrical to be natural, though it clearly was. The photo was still on my phone. I pulled it up and held it next to the sketch. Same formation, same angle, same wedge stone at the base. ERV had been there 99 years before me and drawn exactly what I'd photographed. I read on. Pages 31 through 35 described a survey of that ridge in meticulous detail. Every tree species noted, every stream crossing measured, the soil composition described at each monument, and woven through the technical language, small observations that didn't belong in a field book. Personal notes. The chain bearer walks this ridge in summer. He photographs the witness stones without knowing their purpose. And later, he will not understand the traverse until he reads it here. The reading is the final link. I set the journal down. My hands had gone cold, not figuratively, actually cold, like I'd been holding ice. The shop was warm, the radiator ticking steadily, but my fingers felt bloodless. I pressed them against the surface of the appraisal table and watched the white spots form and fade as I lifted them. The reading is the final link. What link? Link in what chain? I thought about chain bearers, the surveyor's assistant who physically carries the measuring chain from point to point, following the surveyor's sightline. The person who doesn't choose the path but enables the measurement. Without the chain bearer, the surveyor can't establish distance. The chain bearer doesn't need to understand the survey. He just needs to walk. I closed the journal. I put it back in the display case. I locked it. Then I took the key off my ring and dropped it in the drawer of the front counter under a stack of receipt books, a small act of separation. Symbolic, maybe. But I needed something between me and those pages. I opened the shop at 10. Sold a 19th century railroad map to a man from Connecticut. Helped a student from the State University find a reproduction of a 1776 broadside for a class project. Normal transactions, normal conversations. The smell of iron gall ink stayed in my nose the entire day, no matter how many times I stepped outside to breathe the cold lake air. That evening, walking home, I passed the bench where I check my phone every morning. I stopped, looked at it, looked at the ground beneath it, and for the first time I wondered, not as a hypothetical, but as a genuine question that demanded an answer, whether there was an iron pin set in the earth directly below that bench. A survey monument, placed in 1923 by a man whose handwriting matched mine, marking a point on a traverse I walk every day without knowing I'm following it. I didn't dig, not yet, but I stood there long enough that a woman walking her dog crossed to the other side of the path to avoid me. I dug the next morning, 6:30, still dark, wearing my work jacket and carrying a garden trowel I'd bought at the hardware store on my way home the night before. The bench sits on a concrete pad at the edge of the waterfront path, surrounded by decorative gravel over packed earth. I knelt beside it, checked that no one was around, and started scraping at the gravel line where the pad met the ground. 4 inches down, my trowel hit metal. It was an iron pin, 3/4 inch diameter, driven flush with a flat washer at the top, corroded green-black in a way that takes decades. Exactly the kind of monument a surveyor would set in 1923. I brushed the dirt away and stared at it in the beam of my phone's flashlight. The washer had stamping on it, but the corrosion was too heavy to read. I took a photograph, replaced the gravel, and walked to work with my hands shaking. At the shop, I pulled out the journal I'd taken the key back from the drawer without consciously deciding to, and opened to page 22. The monument described at this point in the traverse: set iron pin with washer, 3/4 inch, flush with grade, at station 7 plus 42. I didn't know what station 7 plus 42 meant in terms of modern measurement, but the location matched. The bearing from the previous station matched. The man had placed that pin 100 years ago, and I'd been sitting above it every morning for 2 years, checking my email, drinking my coffee, entirely unaware. I checked 2 more points that week. One at the corner where I wait for the crosswalk, nothing visible, but I couldn't dig through asphalt. The other at the base of the steps leading up to my shop's building. I didn't have to dig there at all. The pin was visible if you knew to look a rusted circle flush with the old concrete, half hidden under the bottom step's overhang. I'd stepped over it 4,000 times. The survey was real. The monuments were physically present. ERV had walked this ground in 1923, placed permanent markers along a traverse, and recorded notes that described my life a century later. Either this was the most elaborate hoax I'd encountered in 20 years of handling historical documents, which would require someone to plant period-appropriate iron pins throughout Harborton, forge a journal on period-appropriate paper with period-appropriate ink, and somehow know my personal walking route before I'd established it, or something else was true, something I didn't have language for. I kept reading. I couldn't help it. The journal had become the only thing I thought about. I'd wake up thinking about it. I'd fall asleep turning phrases from the entries over in my mind. The smell of iron gall ink had become constant, not just in the shop or my apartment, but everywhere, faint and persistent, like a frequency only I could tune to. Pages 36 through 40 shifted the survey again. New terrain, new monuments, but the same convergent pattern, all traverses radiating from a central point and returning. The central point was always my shop, or rather, the geographic coordinates where my shop now stands. In 1923, it would have been an empty lot on the waterfront, perhaps a dock or a storage yard. ERV treated it as his primary control point. Every survey in the journal referenced back to it. In modern terms, it was his benchmark, the fixed point from which all other measurements derived their accuracy. I was living inside his coordinate system, working inside it, sleeping inside it. On Thursday of that weekday 7 of ownership, Niels came in again. He had a folder with him this time. Photocopies from the state archives, he said. The Registry of Licensed Surveyors for Vermont, 1880 through 1950. Looked up your man, he said, setting the folder on my counter with the careful satisfaction of someone delivering a gift. ERV Emmett Voss, licensed in Alcott County, 1921. Worked mostly private boundary surveys, some road work for the town of Bridgewater. He tapped the photocopy. Here's the interesting thing, no record of him after 1923. License lapsed, never renewed. No forwarding address with the registry. Voss. I heard the name and felt my throat close. Not surprised, exactly, more like confirmation of something I'd already known and been refusing to know. Voss, I said, like me. Like you. Niels was watching my face. Common enough name, I suppose. Lots of German families through this part of Vermont in the 1800s. He paused. You want me to look into it further? Could check census records, see if there's a family connection. No, I said, leave it alone. But he didn't leave. He stood at the counter for a long moment, looking at the display case where the journal sat behind glass. You're still reading it, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes. Good. That word hung in the air between us. He picked up his folder and walked out. The bell above the door rang once, and then it was quiet, except for the radiator and the sound of my own breathing. I spent the weekend trying to disprove it. That's what I told myself, not that I was investigating further, but that I was building a case for the rational explanation, the coincidence explanation. The one where Emmett Voss was a distant relative I'd never heard of. The handwriting similarity was genetic. The address was a misreading, and the monuments were standard survey markers that happened to align with my daily path, the way any century-old infrastructure underlies a modern city. I started with the name. Voss isn't rare. Niels was right about that. My father's family came from this part of Vermont, originally dairy farmers, then tradesmen, then a generation that scattered to Boston and Hartford and Albany in the 60s. My grandfather's name was Harold Voss. His father was Frederick. Beyond Frederick, I'd never looked, because genealogy had never interested me. Old paper interests me as a commodity, not as a personal connection. I've always been more comfortable appraising someone else's history than rummaging through my own. But now I rummaged. I spent Saturday at the State Historical Society's online portal, searching census records, birth and death indices, county clerk filings. Frederick Voss appeared in the 1910 census and Grafton Falls occupation listed as machinist. His household included a wife, Dorothy, and 3 children. No Emmett. I searched the 1920 census. Same household, now with 4 children. Still no Emmett. I widened the search. Any Emmett Voss in Vermont between 1900 and 1930. Nothing in the census. Nothing in the birth index. But in the death index, there. Emmett R. Voss, date of death November 4th, 1924. Filed in Alcott County. No cause listed. No certificate number cross-referenced. I clicked through to the scanned image of the index page. The entry was there in typed text on a ledger line. Voss, Emmett R. November 4th, 1924, Alcott County. Male age 34. That was all. No burial location, no next of kin. No reference to a physician's report or a coroner's finding. But it was enough. The man had died. 1924, a year after the journal entries. He was a real person who lived and died and was recorded, however minimally, in the vital records of the state. And he was not in my family tree. Not in Frederick's household, not in any branch I could locate. A Voss, yes, but not my Voss, not related to me. Just a shared surname in a state full of German heritage families. I felt something release in my chest. A tension I'd been holding for a week without naming it. I sat back in my chair and actually laughed a short, embarrassed sound, like waking from a dream where you'd been afraid of something stupid. Of course it was coincidence. A surveyor named Voss worked in Alcott County 100 years ago. His field book ended up at an estate sale. Another Voss, bought it. The address was a misreading, probably a parcel number I'd conflated with my own address because I was primed to see connections. The handwriting similarity was confirmation bias. The monuments were standard survey infrastructure present throughout any Vermont town. I closed my laptop. I went to the deli on Elm Street and bought a beer and a sandwich and sat by the window watching people walk past in the early dark. It was over. I'd sell the journal the following week. Maybe to Niels he'd clearly wanted it. Sunday, I didn't think about the journal at all. I cleaned my apartment, did laundry, called my sister in New Hampshire. Normal things. The smell of iron gall ink was gone, or I'd stopped noticing it, which amounts to the same thing. Monday morning, I opened the shop and decided to finalize the listing. I took the journal from the display case, intending to photograph the remaining pages for the catalog description. I hadn't read past page 40. I figured I'd skim the rest, note the total page count, describe the condition of the final entries, and price it to move. I turned to the death index page I'd found online. November 4th, 1924. Then I turned to the last dated entry in the journal, November 3rd, 1923. 1 year and 1 day before the recorded death. I'd assume more entries might follow, but no, November 3rd was the last. And after the last entry, 3 blank pages, then something I hadn't seen before. A loose sheet tucked between the final blank page and the back cover. Thin paper, onion skin, folded twice. I unfolded it. It was a death certificate form. Vermont Department of Health, standard issue circa 1920s, pre-printed fields for name, date, cause, physician signature. All blank, completely unfilled, except for one line, written in ERV's hand at the top of the form, not in the designated fields but across the margin, like a note to himself. Filed without cause, no body recovered, no witness to the moment. I put the sheet down. The relief I'd felt on Saturday was gone, replaced by something heavier. A death index entry with no corresponding certificate. A blank death certificate form inside the dead man's own journal, annotated in his own hand. He knew he'd be declared dead. He wrote about it in advance, and the form was never completed because there was no body, no proof, no death at all, just a filing. Emmett Voss wasn't dead. He was declared dead. Those aren't the same thing. I should tell you about the final entry now. I've been avoiding it the way you avoid looking directly at something you've seen in peripheral vision. Acknowledging it would require a response, and I didn't have one. November 3rd, 1923, the last dated page. I'd glanced at it earlier in the week, but hadn't read it carefully because the preceding entries had consumed my attention. Now I sat at the appraisal table with the morning light coming in flat and gray. The sky had gone overcast, the lake invisible behind cloud, and read it word by word. It began like every other entry. Date, weather notation. Clear, 38 degrees Fahrenheit, light wind, NW. Starting monument. But within the first paragraph, the technical language gave way to something else. The surveyor was still describing terrain, still recording bearings and distances, but the landscape he described didn't exist in 1923. He was surveying forward. The street names he referenced, Cannon, Elm, Lakeshore, wouldn't be platted for decades. The buildings he described as landmarks hadn't been built. He was mapping a Harborton that existed only in my present, writing it down as if he could see it clearly, as if the future were a landscape he could sight through his transit and record. The entry ran 3 pages longer than any other in the journal. The final page was the one that had been changing. I knew this because I'd photographed it on day 2, and when I compared my photograph to the page now, new lines had appeared. Not appended at the end, inserted within the existing text, as if they'd always been there, but my camera had somehow failed to capture them. The ink matched perfectly. The spacing accommodated the additions without crowding. Impossible. The new lines described a man, age 41, dark hair silvering at the temples, a scar on the chin, left side, from a childhood fall crescent shape, approximately 1 centimeter. The man works in paper and old books. He returned to his home region after a period of displacement. He walks the same route each morning without knowing he's following a survey line. He will buy this journal on a Wednesday in October and spend 11 days reading it. I touched the scar on my chin. I got it. When I was 14, went over the handlebars of my bike on a gravel road in Grafton Falls and hit a rock. Crescent-shaped, left side, 1 centimeter. My mother drove me to the urgent care and they glued it shut. I've carried it for 27 years, a small scar. Something no one notices unless they're looking closely or unless they're drawing your face with a surveyor's precision. I turned the page. The sketch was on the verso. A portrait in graphite, not a casual rendering, but a measured drawing, the kind a draftsman would produce. My face, seen from slightly above and to the left, as if the artist were standing while I sat. The proportions were exact, not impressionistic, not approximate exact, with fine pencil lines extending from feature to feature with tiny numerical notations. The distance between my pupils, the width of my nose, the angle of my jawline, the scar rendered in careful cross-hatching with its measurement noted beside it. I looked at that drawing for a long time. I don't know how long. The radiator clicked through 2 cycles. The light through the window shifted from gray to slightly less gray. At some point, I realized I was holding my breath and let it out in a shudder that started in my diaphragm and moved upward through my chest. The drawing was me, not someone who resembled me, me. As I look right now today, at 41, with the particular way my face has settled into middle age, the lines around my eyes that appeared in my late 30s, the slight asymmetry of my brow from sleeping on my left side for 20 years. Details no one could extrapolate from a younger version. Details that require seeing me as I am now. Below the portrait, in ERV's hand, a single line. The chain bearer at the point of recognition. This is the final monument. I closed the journal. I put it in the display case. I locked it. I walked out of the shop without turning off the lights or locking the door. I walked down to the waterfront and stood at the edge of the break wall looking at the lake. And the wind hit my face like a flat hand, and the cold went through my jacket, and I stood there until my legs ached, because I didn't know where else to be. The final monument. In surveying, a monument is a permanent marker that fixes a point in space. It doesn't move. It's the reference from which all other measurements flow. A monument isn't measured, it's what you measure from. You don't arrive at a monument. You start from one. He wasn't describing my face. He was fixing me in place, pinning me to a coordinate, making me into something that can't move because the entire system depends on me staying exactly where I am. 3 days passed where I didn't open the journal. I left it in the display case and worked around it, rearranging inventory, updating my website, answering emails with a mechanical attention that felt like performing normalcy for an audience of no one. I ate at regular times. I slept or lay in bed with my eyes closed counting the hours until the alarm. The smell of iron gall ink was back in my apartment, not faint anymore, but present, settled into the fabric of my furniture like cigarette smoke in a motel room. I kept the windows open despite the cold. It didn't help. On the fourth day, a Thursday, I drove to Whitfield. The state archives are housed in a nondescript office building off the main avenue, climate-controlled, fluorescent lit, the kind of place where important records go to be forgotten in an orderly manner. I told myself I was going to verify the surveyor's license, to confirm that Emmett R. Voss existed as a professional, with a paper trail that began and ended within normal parameters. To prove he was just a man who'd lived and worked and died or disappeared, and whose journal had come to me through nothing more remarkable than the entropy of estate sales. The archivist was a young man in his 20s, helpful in that slightly bored way of government employees who rarely get visitors. He pulled the physical registry for me, a bound volume covering licensed surveyors from 1910 through 1940. I found the entry on page 63, Voss, Emmett R., license number 1147, issued March 12, 1921. Alcott County. Examination score noted in the margin, 94. A good score. A competent man. Below the license entry, a second notation in different ink added later, the handwriting institutional rather than personal. License lapse not renewed, 1924. See file 1147-C. I asked the archivist about file 1147-C. He disappeared into the back for 15 minutes and returned with a manila folder, thin, containing 3 sheets of paper. The first was a standard non-renewal notice, a form letter informing Voss that his license would lapse if not renewed by March of 1924. It had been mailed to a Bridgewater address, no record of response. The second was a note from the county clerk's office, dated June 1924, requesting confirmation of Voss's status for a property transaction. The note mentioned surveyed parcels pending final registration, and asked whether Voss was available to certify his own work. No response on file. The third sheet stopped me. It was a letter handwritten on personal stationery, addressed to the Vermont Board of Land Surveyors, dated September 1924. The handwriting was ERV's. I recognized it instantly. The forward lean, the upward ticking T crossings, the spatial rhythm I knew as well as my own. The letter read, To the board, I am writing to confirm that the surveys conducted under License 1147 in Alcott County and Chamford County between April and November of 1923 are complete and accurate. All monuments are set. All traverse is close within acceptable error. The chain bearer has not yet arrived, but the work will hold. I have made provisions for the field book to remain in accessible custody until such time as it is needed. The final entry will complete itself upon reading. I require nothing further from the board. E. R. Voss. The chain bearer has not yet arrived. I read the letter 3 times. The archivist had drifted back to his desk. The fluorescent tubes above me buzzed at a frequency I could feel in my molars. The date, September 1924, was 6 weeks before the death index entry. 6 weeks before he was declared dead without a body, without a cause, without a witness. He'd written to the licensing board, essentially closing his professional affairs, and then vanished into a bureaucratic declaration of death that he himself seemed to have anticipated. I photographed the letter with my phone. My hands were steady, which surprised me. Something had shifted, not toward calm, but toward a kind of cold clarity. The fear was still there, but it had migrated deeper, below the level where it produced trembling or nausea. It had become structural, part of how I was processing information now. I drove back to Harborton on Route 14, the long way, through the river valley where the last leaves were coming down in the wind. I thought about the phrase, "The final entry will complete itself upon reading." Not "I will complete it," not "someone will complete it." It will complete itself. As if the act of being read was the mechanism. As if my eyes on the page were the chain, and looking was the measurement. I thought about the estate sale in Bridgewater, the woman who wouldn't give her name, the sparse listing with the handwritten JPEG. No family, that's why we're here. I pulled over at a gas station in Redmond and searched my phone for the listing. The estate liquidation board where I'd found it. I scrolled back through October's posts. The listing was gone. Not archived, not expired. Gone. No record it had existed. I checked my browser history. The URL returned a 404 error. I sat in my truck in the gas station parking lot and watched the traffic pass on Route 14 and felt the world rearranging itself around a fact I couldn't yet name. I decided to stop. That's the word I used, decided, as if I had authority over what was happening. I put the journal in a cardboard box, wrapped the box in packing tape, and placed it on the highest shelf in the shop's back storage room, behind a crate of unsorted estate maps I'd been meaning to catalog for a year. Then I went home and threw out the garden trowel and deleted the photographs from my phone. All of them, the monument, the field book pages, the letter from the archives. I emptied my recently deleted folder too. Gone. For 2 weeks, I didn't touch it. I didn't think about it, or rather, I didn't allow myself to finish thoughts about it. They would start, the way intrusive thoughts start, and I'd redirect. I reorganized the shop's entire New England history section. I drove to an estate sale in Northfield and bought a box of 19th century postcards that kept me busy with listings for days. I called my sister twice. I went to a bar on Chapel Street on a Saturday night and sat alone with a beer and watched a hockey game I didn't care about, just to be in a room with other people and normal noise. The smell faded, or I got used to it. By the second week, I couldn't detect it at all unless I pressed my nose to my own fingertips, and even then it might have been imagination. I started sleeping through the night again. I stopped checking the scar on my chin in the mirror every morning. I stopped looking for iron pins in the ground. Niels came in on the second Thursday. I was behind the counter pricing a set of Audubon Prince reproductions, not originals, but nice ones, and he walked in with that proprietary stride, heading straight for the map section the way he always does. He browsed for a while. I didn't engage. After 10 minutes, he came to the counter with a rolled print, a 1950s USGS quad map of the Hinton area. $7, I said without looking up. Garrett. His voice was different, quieter. I looked up. He was holding the map roll but not offering it for purchase. He was studying me. "You stopped reading it." I didn't answer. "I can tell," he said. "You look better. More color. Sleeping again." He said it like a doctor noting symptoms. "But you know that's temporary." "I don't know what you're talking about." The lie was thin, and I didn't bother thickening it. He set the map roll on the counter. "Let me tell you something. 20 years ago, maybe 22, I bought a transit at a flea market in Vergères. Brass, 1890s, beautiful instrument. And underneath the base plate, someone had scratched coordinates. Just numbers, no context. I spent a weekend trying to figure out what they pointed to." He paused. "It was my house, not the street, my house. The corner of my kitchen where I eat breakfast." I waited. I sold the transit, took it to a dealer in New York, and got $300 for it and never looked back. He picked up the map roll again, rolled it tighter between his palms. "But that was just coordinates, numbers. Easy to dismiss as coincidence. What you have is different. What you have is a conversation. And conversations don't end just because one person stops talking. What do you want, Niels? I want you to finish reading it." No hesitation, no softening. "I've been collecting survey ephemera for 30 years. I've never seen anything like what's in that journal. And I think if you don't finish it, if you don't let it complete whatever it's completing, it'll find another way." "Another way to what?" He looked at me with something that wasn't quite sympathy and wasn't quite hunger. "To close the traverse," he said. "Every survey has to close. You can't leave a line hanging open. It's not just bad practice, it's structurally impossible. The mathematics won't allow it. An open traverse has no accuracy, no meaning. It's just a line going nowhere." He set the map roll back in the bin without paying for it. "You're the closure, Garrett. Whatever he started in 1923, you're the point it comes back to." He left. The bell rang. The shop was quiet. I stood behind the counter for a long time, not moving, feeling the floor solid under my feet and wondering if that solidity was real or if I was standing on a point someone else had chosen for me a century ago. The radiator clicked. The light through the windows was the pale, flat light of early November, and I watched it move across the floorboards and thought about open traverses and closure and how a line that doesn't return to its starting point is considered an error. That night, the smell came back. Not gradually, all at once, like a door opening. I was brushing my teeth, and the iron gall hit me so hard my eyes watered. I spat into the sink and looked at my toothbrush, and the bristles were stained faintly brown, the color of old ink diluted in water. I went to the shop at midnight. I took the box down from the shelf. I cut the packing tape. I opened the journal. The journal was different. Not in any way I could have documented for a buyer or an appraiser. The physical object was the same leather-bound field book, same brass clasp, same rag paper. But the last entry had grown again. The portrait page now had annotations I'd never seen, tiny notations in the margins, measurements I hadn't photographed because they hadn't existed when I'd last looked. And after the portrait, on what had been a blank page, new text. It was dated. That's what made my stomach drop. Not the content, not yet, but the date. November 3rd, 1923, the same date as the final entry, the same day, but clearly written later as a continuation, because it referenced the portrait. The chain bearer has seen himself. The recognition is the penultimate monument. One remains. I read on. The new text was denser than the earlier entries, less technical, more direct. The surveyor's voice had shifted from professional notation to something closer to address. He was speaking to someone, to me. "You will attempt to stop reading. You will seal the book away for a period of days or weeks. This is expected, and does not interrupt the traverse. The line holds whether you walk it consciously or not. Your daily route has not changed during your absence from these pages. You have continued to carry the chain. I thought about the 2 weeks I'd just spent not reading. He was right. I hadn't changed my route. I'd walk the same path every morning: apartment, bench, waterfront, Cannon Street, shop. I'd done it without thinking, the way I always did. I'd been following the traverse the entire time I thought I'd stopped. The next paragraph made me set the journal down and press my palms flat against the table. The convergence requires only one additional act. The chain bearer must produce the final entry in his own hand. The traverse closes when the last measurement is recorded by the one who walked it. I have provided the monuments, the bearings, the distances. The chain bearer provides the verification. Without his hand on the page, the survey remains open. With it, the work is certified and the line is complete. He wanted me to write in the journal. That was the completion, not reading or writing. My hand on his page, and whatever handwriting we shared, closing the loop between 1923 and now. I pulled my hands away from the table like it was hot. I stood up and stepped back from the appraisal table, and the journal lay there open in the lamplight, and I looked at my hands. My hands that smelled like iron gall ink even when they hadn't touched the book, and I thought about what it would mean to write in it, what it would change, what it would close. I got a blank sheet of paper from the printer behind the counter. I sat back down, not at the appraisal table, but at the front counter, away from the journal. I took a pen, a modern ballpoint, black ink, nothing special, and I wrote my name, Garrett Voss. Then I wrote it again, and again, 5 times down the page. Then I looked at what I'd written. The first signature was mine. My normal hand slightly rushed, the G a little compressed, the double T in Garrett crossed with a single horizontal stroke. Normal. The second was almost the same, but the T crossing had that upward tick. The third, the letters had more space between them, more deliberate pressure. Forward lean, increasing. By the 5th signature, I was looking at ERV's handwriting. Not similar to it, not influenced by it, identical. The same hand that had written every entry in the journal over a 100-year-old field season was now coming out of my fingers without effort, without intention, like muscle memory for emotion I'd never consciously learned. I dropped the pen. It rolled off the counter and hit the floor. My hands were trembling, not with cold this time, but with something electrical, a fine rapid vibration running from my wrist to my fingertips. I pressed them between my knees and squeezed until the shaking stopped. The journal was still open on the appraisal table across the room. I could see the portrait from where I sat, my own face looking back at me from a page written before my grandfather was born. And below it, that instruction, that invitation, the final monument, the one I had to set myself. I didn't write in it that night. I closed it, put it back in the display case, locked it, and went home. But the whole way back down Cannon Street, along the waterfront path, past the bench, up the hill to Lakeshore Terrace, I felt the traverse beneath my feet like a current, like the ground remembered being measured and was waiting to be measured again. And my hands, shoved deep in my jacket pockets, kept twitching in small rhythmic motions, the motion of writing, the motion of someone forming letters they haven't decided to form yet. The next morning, I didn't go to the shop. I drove to Bridgewater, back to Creek Road, back to the cedar-shingled Cape Cod where I'd bought the journal 6 weeks earlier. I needed to see the house again. I needed to verify that the estate sale had been real, that there had been a house, a woman, a crate of surveying equipment, a transaction that existed in the physical world, and not only in my increasingly unreliable memory. The house was there. Same stone wall, same cedar shingles weathering to gray. But it was different. The windows were dark, not because no one was home, but because they were empty. No curtains, no blinds, no glass in 2 of the upper frames. The front door stood slightly ajar, and through the gap I could see bare floors covered in a layer of dust that didn't look 6 weeks old. It looked like years, a decade at least. Leaves had blown in and composted against the baseboards in dark, wet mats. The smell coming from inside was mildew and cold stone and the sweet chemical rot of disintegrating wallpaper paste. No one had lived here in a long time. No one had held an estate sale here 6 weeks ago. The boxes of books, the filing cabinet, the framed maps, none of it could have been here, in this state, in this house. Either I'd come to the wrong address or the sale had never happened the way I remembered it. I checked the address on my phone. Creek Road, the number I'd saved when I first found the listing. This was the house. I walked around to the back. The yard was overgrown, not autumn overgrown, but abandoned overgrown, with volunteer saplings pushing up through what had been a garden, and a section of fence collapsed under the weight of wild grapevines. A bulkhead door leading to the basement was padlocked, with a lock so rusted the hasp had fused to the plate. I drove to the town clerk's office in Bridgewater, a small room off the main corridor of the municipal building, smelling of coffee and toner. The clerk was a woman in her 50s with reading glasses on a chain. I asked about the property on Creek Road, who owned it, whether there'd been a recent sale or estate action. She looked it up, typed slowly, squinting at her screen. That property's been in estate limbo since, 2004. Owner deceased, no probate filed, no heirs identified. It's been flagged for tax sale for 11 years, but never goes through. Lien complications. She looked at me over her glasses. Why? I bought something there, at an estate sale, about 6 weeks ago. She shook her head. There's been no sale authorized on that property, no estate liquidation. The house has been vacant since the owner died. She clicked her mouse a few times. Owner of record, let me see one, Emmett R. Voss, deceased 2004. The room tilted. Not physically, the floor didn't move, the walls stayed where they were, but my perception of the room's relationship to me shifted, like a camera pulling focus. Emmett R. Voss, deceased 2004. Not 1924. 2004. 80 years later than the death index entry. 80 years during which a man who'd been officially declared dead in 1924 apparently continued to live, to own property, to exist in municipal records under the same name. Can you tell me anything else about the owner? My voice sounded far away. Date of birth? Any other records? She scrolled. Date of birth listed as, that can't be right. She tapped her screen. It says 1890. Birth year 1890. That would make him 114 at time of death. She frowned. Probably a data entry error from when they digitized the old records. Happens all the time with these legacy properties. I thanked her. I walked out of the municipal building into the November cold and stood on the sidewalk, and the wind blew leaves past my ankles, and I tried to do the math that wouldn't resolve. Born 1890. Licensed as a surveyor in 1921 at age 31. Last journal entry, 1923 at age 33. Declared dead in 1924. Property owner until 2004. Deceased at the age of 114. Or 34. Or something else entirely. Something that didn't fit inside a human lifespan, because it wasn't a human lifespan. It was a surveying term. A traverse. A line that runs from one monument to the next, however far apart they are. I sat in my truck for 20 minutes without starting the engine. Then I drove back to Harborton, and the whole way I felt the journal waiting for me like a conversation I'd stepped away from mid-sentence. I called my mother that night. She lives in Grafton Falls still, in the house where I grew up, a split level on a cul-de-sac that my father built out with a sunroom before he died in 2017. She's 73, sharp, keeps a garden, doesn't ask too many questions about my divorce or my business. I love her for that restraint. I asked if she still had my old schoolwork, the boxes from the attic, the ones she'd threatened to throw out every spring cleaning but never did. She said of course. I asked if I could come get them. She didn't ask why, just said she'd leave the attic ladder down. Saturday morning I drove to Grafton Falls. 2 hours south on Route 9, through the valley, past the ski towns already advertising early season passes, My mother had coffee waiting and didn't press. I spent an hour in the attic going through 3 cardboard boxes labeled in her handwriting. Garrett's School, Grades 1 to 6. Construction paper art projects. Book reports in blunt pencil. Spelling tests with gold stars. And at the bottom of the second box, a stack of handwriting practice sheets from 1st and 2nd grade. The sheets were standard ruled paper with dotted midlines, letters printed at the top for the student to copy below. My name, written at the top right of each sheet in my teacher's hand, Garrett V. And below, my attempts, age 6, age 7. The clumsy loops and uncertain pressure of a child learning to control a pencil. I held them up to the light from the attic's single bulb and felt something go quiet inside me. Not calm absence, the absence of the last thing I'd been holding on to. My handwriting at age 7 was already his. The letter formations, the spatial relationships, the idiosyncratic proportions, they were present from the start. Not emerging through practice, not learned. Already there, the way an accent is already in a child's voice before they know what an accent is. My 2nd grade T crossings had that upward tick. My 1st grade lowercase a's had that particular counter shape slightly narrower than standard, with the bowl leaning forward. My teacher had marked several sheets with corrections. Watch your slant. Keep letters upright. She'd been trying to train his handwriting out of me. I sat on the attic floor with the sheets spread around me and the dust turning in the light, and I thought about what it means to have a handwriting that isn't learned. Handwriting is supposed to be acquired. It's motor memory built through repetition. You practice the forms until your hand produces them automatically. But mine hadn't been built. It was installed. Present from the first time I held a pencil, as if the muscle memory predated the muscle. I gathered the sheets carefully, put them back in the box, and carried the box down to my truck. My mother asked if I'd found what I needed. I said yes. She looked at me the way she used to look at me when I came home from school, with a note from the teacher, not angry, not worried, just watchful, waiting to see if I'd tell her what was wrong. Mom, do you know anything about a relative named Emmett? Emmett Voss? Her expression didn't change. She picked up her coffee mug and took a slow sip. Where did you hear that name? In some old records, for a project. Your grandfather mentioned him once. His uncle, I think. Or great-uncle, Black Sheep. Left the family before Harold was born. She set the mug down. Your grandfather said he was a surveyor. Said he went strange. That's the word he used, strange. And then he was gone. Nobody talked about him after that. Gone how? I don't know, Garrett. It was one conversation 30 years ago. Your grandfather was a man of few words, and most of them were about the weather. She paused. Why? Just curious. The lie felt enormous in my mouth, too large to swallow. I kissed her goodbye and drove back to Harborton with the box of schoolwork on the passenger seat, exactly where the journal had sat 6 weeks ago when I drove home from the estate sale. The estate sale that never happened, in the house that's been vacant for 20 years, for the man who died twice, once on paper in 1924, once in municipal records in 2004, and perhaps not at all. I got home at 4 in the afternoon. I sat at my kitchen table and laid a practice sheet next to the journal, open to a random page. I didn't need a photograph anymore. I didn't need a side-by-side comparison. The match was visible without looking. I could feel it in my hand every time I picked up a pen. The handwriting had never been mine to develop. It had been placed in me, like a monument set in the earth, waiting for the survey to reach it. It's been 3 days since Grafton Falls. I'm writing this at the appraisal table in my shop, 2 in the morning, with the journal open beside me. The lake is invisible in the dark outside the windows, but I can hear the wind coming off it, pressing against the old glass in the frames. The radiator ticks. The fluorescent in the back room hums at its usual frequency. Everything is normal except for what I'm about to tell you. Last night I opened the journal to the final entry, the November 3rd page, the one that keeps growing, and found a new paragraph. It hadn't been there 3 days ago when I last looked. I know this with certainty, because I've started photographing the page every time I open it, timestamping each image, building a record of the additions. This new paragraph was longer than the others. It described in ERV's precise technical language the interior of my shop, the appraisal table, the position of the lamp, the display case, the cardboard box of schoolwork I'd brought in from my truck that afternoon and set on the floor beside the counter. Details from yesterday, written in 1923, and below that paragraph, a blank space, wide enough for a passage of text, ruled faintly with pencil guidelines the kind a surveyor draws to keep his field notes level. An invitation, a space waiting to be filled. I sat with it for an hour without moving. The smell of iron gall ink was so strong I could taste it metallic, astringent, coating the back of my throat. My hands rested on the table on either side of the journal, and every few minutes they'd twitch. That writing motion. The small rhythmic flex of fingers, preparing to form letters. I thought about what Niels had said. Every survey has to close. An open traverse has no accuracy, no meaning. I thought about the chain bearer, the person who doesn't choose the path, but makes measurement possible. I thought about Emmett Voss, born 1890, declared dead 1924, property owner until 2004, whose handwriting has lived in my muscles since before I could read. I thought about what it means to be a monument fixed, permanent, the point from which all other measurements derive their truth. And then I thought about what happens if I don't write in it. If the traverse stays open, if the line hangs incomplete, uncertified, an error in the record that never resolves. Niels said it would find another way. Maybe he's right. Maybe the handwriting will keep bleeding into mine until there's no difference at all. Maybe the smell will thicken until I can't breathe anything else. Maybe the journal will keep writing itself, adding paragraphs about my present that were somehow authored in my past until the distinction between the surveyor and the chain bearer collapses entirely and I become the man who wrote the journal that I'm reading. A closed loop. A traverse that terminates at its own origin. I haven't written in it. Not yet. But I need to tell you what I found this morning that made me decide to record all of this, right now, before anything else changes. I came into the shop at 6 a.m. The display case was locked. The journal inside, the brass clasp fastened, everything as I'd left it. But on the appraisal table on the clean, empty surface, where nothing had been when I left last night, there was a sheet of paper, modern printer paper, from the stack behind my counter. And on it, in my handwriting or his handwriting, there's no difference now, a single paragraph. A description of a man. Not me. Someone else. A name I don't recognize. An age. A physical description. A set of habits and roots. A man who will walk into an antique shop in Harborton, Vermont, on a weekday next spring, and find a leather-bound surveyor's field book in a display case, priced at $475. A man who will buy it because the handwriting looks familiar. I didn't write it. I have no memory of writing it. But it's my hand on the page, the same slant, the same pressure, the same upward-ticking T-crossings that my first-grade teacher tried to correct. And it's on paper I keep in my own shop, written with a pen I found uncapped on the counter this morning. The traverse is closing. Not because I chose to complete it, but because the completion doesn't require my permission. I'm the chain bearer. I carry the measurement forward. And somewhere in the gap between sleeping and waking, between intention and action, my hand is already doing what his hand designed it to do 100 years ago. The journal is in the display case right now, priced, listed, waiting. And I can't bring myself to remove it, because some part of me, the part that writes without remembering, the part that walks the same route every morning over monuments, I didn't set. That part knows the next chain bearer is already on his way, already following a line he can't see yet, already carrying a handwriting he thinks is his own. I keep telling myself I'll close the shop, pull the listing, destroy the journal. But every morning I unlock the door and turn on the lights, and the display case is still there, and the journal is still inside it, and the price tag is still facing outward. And every night when I check my hands under the lamp, the ink stain on my fingertips is a little darker than it was the day before.